You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive-compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories. And welcome to episode 469 of the podcast. And in this one, I chat with Rachael, who has kindly agreed to share her OCD story with us. We discuss OCD themes, including harm, postnatal fears of developing psychosis, existential, religious, and health anxiety. We talk about exposure and response prevention therapy, learnings from ERP, how her partner helped, shame, and much more. And thank you to NoCD for supporting the podcast. NoCD offers effective and convenient therapy available in the US and outside the US. To find out more about NoCD, their therapy plans, if they currently take your insurance, or to download their free app, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories, or the link will be in the episode description. Thank you to all of our patrons for supporting our work. To sign up to our Patreon and to check out the other benefits you'll receive as a patron, please see the link in the show notes. So thank you to Rachael for her time and sharing her story. It was lovely to chat with her and hear her story. And of course, thank you to you guys for listening. As always, it means a lot. Without further ado, here is Rachael. Welcome to the podcast, Rachael.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have you here. So, as you know, it's your OCD story. So I'd like to hear that in as little or as much detail as you want to give.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. I always say to people that OCD kind of hit me out of nowhere in 2013, of February in 2013. I can remember it. But now that I know a little bit more about OCD, I can see undertones of it, throughout my childhood. But I'll start at that day at February. I was sitting in my living room and the thought popped in my head. This is going to sound so crazy, but I guess people with OCD are listening to this podcast. So I'll try to avoid the shame that I still kind of struggle with here and there around it. But the thought popped into my head, what if I took a gun and shot my sister who was sitting next to me? And that it was just literally just out of the blue. And I was like, oh my God, that was so weird. Why would I ever think that? And then we got on with whatever we were doing. And when she left, I just kept reeling over this thought, like, oh my God, like, why would I ever think that? I'm a nurse, so my nature is very kind and calm, calm and loving. I love people. I take care of people. That I dedicated my whole life to that. So it was just so against everything I stood for. And in the United States at that time, there was a lot of gun violence going on, which was really kind of triggering for me. So I struggled with that thought for weeks. It even made me physically ill. And the more I thought about it, the more the question became like, is this something I wanted to do? And to me, there was no difference between somebody who wanted to do something like that and somebody who actually did do something like that. Even though, like, in my in my heart of hearts, I knew that this was not something I wanted to do. The thought was just, I guess really what I was doing was compulsing and checking if that, what this thought said about me. So that really kind of sent me down this downward spiral of these intrusive thoughts. So I didn't tell anybody because I had so much shame about it, but I was really struggling with, like, what does this say about me as a person? Am I secretly a serial killer and a violent person who wants to hurt somebody? Oh my gosh, I didn't eat for weeks. I couldn't sleep. Every object in my home suddenly became a weapon that I could use to harm somebody. So finally I was like, I gotta tell somebody because I think I need to be locked away. And I wanted to be, I know that sounds crazy, but I really wanted to be, because the thought of like harming somebody was so unbearable to me. It was just awful. So I made an appointment with a therapist who, I didn't even, to me, OCD was somebody who was entirely neat, and I am not. I am like the messiest person. I don't care about those types of things. So OCD never even crossed my mind. So I made an appointment with a therapist and was very emotional when I was telling her. And I said, I'm very embarrassed. This is hard for me to tell you. And she, now looking back, now that I've been to a therapist that actually knows OCD, she knew nothing about OCD. So it just made it 10 times worse. Her treatment was for me to, every time I wrote down. However, I do think she knew, I think because of how, I think she could tell that this was like very ego dystonic for me, that, I was really struggling with them. So, I said, if you need to call the police, I understand. Like, I might be a serial killer. I don't know. It was horrible, but
Yeah.
either way, she had me put a rubber band on my wrist. And every time I felt that, she would make me flick my wrist. So it was constant. So then she had me write down all the reasons I would never harm somebody. Again, so against anything you would ever want to do with OCD. So I did that therapy probably for about a year, and I just was it probably was the darkest time of my life. It was really, really hard. These thoughts spread onto anyone that I loved, anything that I cared about, including animals. And it was just, I think for somebody who doesn't have OCD versus talking to somebody who's lived it, the amount of time and space that these thoughts can occupy your mind is absolutely astounding. I mean, when I say 24/7, it was constant. And now looking back, now that I know more about OCD, it was really rumination that was occupying my mind 24/7. But at that time, I didn't know it. I didn't even know I had OCD. I just thought I was secretly became a serial killer overnight. And anyway, then finally I got brave enough to search on the internet, like, what's happening to me, and OCD popped up. And I'm like, God, there's no way I have OCD. Like, I'm the messiest person you'd ever meet. Like, there's no way. And then this book, Imp of the Mind, kind of came up on my Google searches, and I read it. And that is the first time in probably a year I had any sort of like, oh my God, this is exactly what's happening to me. So I read Imp of the Mind, and I went to this therapist who was well-meaning, but again, knew nothing about OCD. And I said to her, like, hey, do you think I could have OCD? And she's like, oh, no, like, there's no way. I'm like, well, I think I might. I said, I really do. I think, I read this book, Imp of the Mind, and it really explains that, like, what we're doing is kind of really exactly what we should not be doing as far as treating me goes. And so she read it. She read Imp of the Mind. And at that point, I kind of felt like maybe this isn't the person I should be seeing. So we kind of parted ways. But before we did, she did read Imp of the Mind, and she kind of said, like, apologetically, like, I never really, I think she was like a licensed social worker. I don't know that she ever went to, like, had like a, I don't know, psychology degree or whatever. But so after I read Imp of the Mind, I really sought out OCD providers who really knew what OCD was. So through that, I kind of just got better on my own in ways like I stopped ruminating. I stopped trying to check what the thoughts meant. And I kind of got, I think just like the nature of OCD waxes and wanes, for whatever reason, it kind of dissipated a little bit, but it did come back with a vengeance after the birth of my daughter, which I'll get into. But so for me then, probably in 2014, it kind of just for whatever reason started to fade, and it really wasn't a problem anymore. So I kind of just went on with my life. I would notice, I did some research. I used, there's this really great website, OCD of LA. And I used that website. Yeah. And they had a lot of really good information. Tom
Corboy, yeah.
Yeah. So I read one of his books, and I was like, oh my God, like, this is what I have. Like, no big deal. I'm not a serial killer. And for whatever reason, other things going on in life, I was finishing a higher degree, and I got busy with life, and it just kind of faded. And for a couple years, I lived life pretty, I don't want to say OCD free, but pretty much. It was not all consuming. But that changed tremendously after the birth of my daughter. So it's funny, when I was in that OCD, like harm OCD feeling, I swore up and down. I said, I can never have kids because I can't even imagine having these thoughts about children. But, I had them anyway. So after the birth of my daughter, my life just turned totally upside down. It was I thought that the harm OCD was the worst time of my life, but OCD in store for me. So after the birth of my daughter, as I now know, OCD tends to flare after, with big life changes. So, I have this little human that I love more than I thought you could ever love a human being. And, the harm thoughts came, but I was like, okay, like, I know what this is. I'm just going to ignore them and not do anything with them. But then this thought of postpartum psychosis came into my mind. So, I really struggled with this fear of going crazy, which I know that you've had people on your podcast who have struggled with that before. And even when I was in the thick of it, I listened to, I can't remember who it was, but I listened to that story. But it's true to OCD for me. It wasn't exactly the way I was suffering. So it wasn't giving me that validation that like, yeah, this is OCD and you're really not going psychotic. So, but now I know that that's just the OCD. But so my fears really were about, going psychotic and thus being able then to, harm my daughter or my family. And then too, like it kind of morphed into this like existential OCD. But the biggest problem for me with the psychosis OCD is like, how would I know? Like, cause it's all about control and like needing to know for sure and having this certainty. How could I certainly know that I wasn't going crazy? And the answer is just like with anything, I really couldn't know that for sure. But my biggest problem was I would look up, or just because I'm a nurse and I'm not a psych nurse, but certainly there's a lot of psychiatric disorders that I deal with in patients. And having dealt with psychotic patients, I would look at their delusions that they would be having. And I would be like, okay, checking. I would be like, okay, do you believe that? Do you think that that could be real? And in my OCD mind, I couldn't convince myself that I didn't believe these delusions that they were having. So to me, that was proof that I was going psychotic, even though it's so weird. And I know that you probably understand, but to somebody who doesn't have OCD would never understand this. To me, even though I knew it wasn't real, I was trying to check to make sure I didn't feel like I believed it, whatever that means. And I couldn't get that certainty. So it was terrifying to me. I mean, I'm even embarrassed to tell you some of the thoughts that I was thinking, but I'll give you one example because it's the one that just kind of replays in my mind. I was one day just like obsessively Googling, like, what kind of delusions do schizophrenic people have? And this one popped up that this schizophrenic person who was in a psychotic break believed that everybody was robots. So I was like, okay, Rachel, like, do you believe that? And of course, I know this is not true. But then in my mind, I was like, I couldn't convince myself, or I couldn't feel certain that I didn't believe that. So to me, that was proof that I was going crazy, thus a threat to society. But then it kind of morphed into existential OCD, where I was like, okay, like, yeah, I know that to not be true, but how could I ever really, really know that? And then it just kind of turned into like, like existential thoughts, like, how do I even know that I'm really alive? And what does it even mean to be really alive? And I was like, gosh, I never even did drugs. Like, I don't deserve these crazy thoughts, but not that anybody who does drugs does, but it just kind of turned into this really, unanswerable questions. But to me, it was all this proof that I was going crazy. And I'm kind of speaking about it lighthearted now, but it was so devastating to me because I had this newborn child that I was responsible for and that I love so much and that I, prayed for so many years. And here I'm going to lose my mind and I'm not even going to be able to enjoy her. And she's going to grow up with, a mother who has this horrible illness. And all the while in the back of my head, I kind of knew, I was like, this feels a lot like the OCD I had before, like the harm OCD.
Yeah.
The theme's different, but that doesn't really matter. It's that same feeling where I just can't feel certain enough that I don't believe these thoughts. So then enter Dr. Schultz, who is the man who saved my life. I owe him so much. So I finally found an OCD therapist who knew OCD because I was to the point where I was like, God, like, I cannot take these thoughts anymore. Like, I can't live like this. Something needs to change. So I found him and I met with him one day and he just, we worked really hard. We did proper exposure response treatment, prevention therapy. And he knew OCD in and out. He, the first day he was funny. He said the first day I'm going to assure you that all you have is OCD and nothing else is going on. He said, but after that, I'm never going to reassure you again. After that, like, we're going to fight through this and you're going to get better and you're going to go on and live a life that is happy and healthy. And I didn't believe him at all at the time. But the problem with me with exposure response is that I use the exposures as a checking compulsion. So when we would do things like, go through these scripts of me going psychotic or go through these scripts of me, harming somebody, I would in my mind use it as like, okay, do you really feel like that's real? Do you really believe that? And he noticed that that's what I was doing. So we kind of stopped doing that. But and we just kind of like, I had to just sit with the thought and sit with the fact that I was never going to have certainty over whether or not I was psychotic, over whether or not I really believed those thoughts, over whether or not I really might want to stab somebody. But all those things didn't matter. What mattered as is my character and how I lived my life, which were completely different from those thoughts I was having. But to me, it really was very hard to separate somebody who, I don't know, to me, having those thoughts was just as bad as wanting to do those things and do those things. Now I know that thoughts are just thoughts and they absolutely mean nothing, but I I still struggle with that a little bit. Like, why would I have these thoughts? I know that everybody does, but the rumination for me was really, really hard. And the constant delusional thinking of like, well, do you believe that? Why does that thought scare you if you don't believe it? If you don't believe it, it shouldn't be scary, but it is scary. But for me, Dr. Schultz, just made it so simple. He was just like, well, they scare you because you have OCD and it's nothing more, nothing less. And if you stop checking, they're going to stop. So this was 2020, March of 2020. So COVID hit in New Jersey bad. And I was a nurse working on the floor with my daughter was 5-6 months old then. And I got COVID before I was probably patient zero in Warren County, New Jersey, where I live. But so I was still seeing him at that time. And he, I'll never forget this. I don't know, these words might seem so significant, but they were so sincere and authentic and felt so, I don't know, he made it feel so believable. OCD can knock you down, and make you feel like you're like the worst person in the world and that you're not deserving of any happiness in life. And that, and it was really, really, it was really tearing me down. So one day he looked at me and he said, Rachel, you are going to be okay. And I was just at that point, COVID had hit. It was dark here. It was just a tough time. And I was in the throes of the worst bout of that OCD that I'd ever had. My mind was constantly consumed by these intrusive thoughts of harm, delusions, of existential OCD. It was just a very hard time. And he said, by the virtue of who you are as a person, you're kind, you have grit, like you are going to be okay. I need you to believe me. And I know that seems so insignificant, but in that moment, I swear it's like fingers snapped. And I just kind of changed my perspective because I had spent so much of my life, even through childhood, again, looking back, I'll talk about that, where OCD showed up in my childhood. I really didn't believe that I had any worth. I thought I was just, I don't know, but to have somebody see you for who you really are, even if you don't really see yourself for that, it just really changed my world. And I would say, that OCD bout, my daughter was born in August. This lasted until March, this horrible bout of OCD where it was constant. And him saying those things to me, him telling me that when we're doing the exposure, you're kind of checking and these are your this is kind of like becoming a compulsion, which I had never heard of the ability for exposures to become compulsions, but I guess they can. And my rumination. And once I realized that that's what I was doing and that's why I wasn't getting better, again, him pointing it out to me, I got so much better, so much faster. And it was, I swore to him after I had my daughter, I said, I'm never going to have another child. Like I can't go through this again. I did. I went out and had a son and I, pretty much live my life, I would say, OCD free. I do not suffer at all if I have an intrusive thought. In fact, sometimes they make me laugh by the absurdity of them, which is somewhere I never thought I would be. I definitely still struggle with like health anxiety, OCD here and there. But now I know the tools to get better. And on the days where it's bad or where it's starting to flare, I have so much in my tool belt to help me get through those things that, if I have a bad OCD day for whatever reason, it's so much more manageable. I don't struggle. I don't suffer the way I did before. So that's kind of my story. That was kind of long, but that's kind of my story. Wild and crazy.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for sharing it. Yeah, and you went through a lot, but I'm glad you are where you are now and you've navigated it all.
Yeah.
You mentioned about childhood just now.
Yeah.
Anything you want to expand on that?
Yeah. So, in my childhood, I guess, like looking back, I can see these themes, mostly religious, themed OCD that I didn't recognize as OCD when I was younger. So I can remember laying in bed at night having these thoughts of like, uh, it's terrible. Like in my brain would be like, oh, I wish I would get possessed because I was like terrified of like demons and like all that demonic stuff. And I grew up in I went to church as a child, not an overly religious family, but a religious family. And I remember just like being like, no, stop thinking that. That's horrible. Like that's, oh my God, stop. And then my brain would say like, like slurs to like God or to Jesus or whatever. And I remember just being so devastated by that, thinking like I am just, my soul is damned now because of, these horrible thoughts that I'm having. And I didn't tell anybody because I was like, oh my God, there's something wrong with me. I would also struggle with like thoughts of like death and dying and what does that mean? A kind of existential OCD. I can remember being a young girl and laying in my bed and really reeling over the thought of infinity. Like, what does that mean? That's so insane to me that something could just never end. How is that possible? And I really struggled with that. I struggled with my own health, like, or health of people around me. Like I wanted to make sure everybody was always okay. I didn't want anyone to get sick. I would worry that if I didn't put a dish down right or something, that would mean that my parents were going to die. Or if something didn't feel right in the way I was doing it, that I was going to die. And if I can make this, kind of like wishful thinking almost like, but again, I didn't recognize it. And I think now, like, looking back in those where things had to be just right or feel just right, it caused a lot of tension in my relationship, specifically with my mother. So like, and I think I couldn't tell her what was going on in my mind. So to her, I was just a frustrating, difficult kid, but really I was suffering, but I couldn't tell her that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the shame,
Yeah.
for everyone, but kids especially, that, like you said, that I felt the same, didn't want to tell anyone, felt that I'd get locked up, taken away, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And it's a shame because, I think early intervention could make a world of difference to a lot of people with OCD. So it never gets to that bad place. Obviously, it was already a bad place for you as a young kid, but you know what I mean? The point where it was,
I think just like knowing what's going on and that it's nothing wrong and it's highly treatable if you know what it is and being educated, because feeling like you're just going crazy or just inherently a bad person is like horrible. And then I think just, early education, knowing what is going on and that it's treatable and that there's nothing wrong with you, would really move mountains for people.
Yeah, 100%. Okay. And is there a partner in your life?
Yes, my husband. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And what's that been like throughout all of this? Did he clock on or?
So he was, it's so funny because I'm like a really highly sensitive person and, he's like stoic and steady. And I think that's why I'm so drawn to him. When I was going through the first bout of OCD and I had so much shame, but with him, I knew I was safe to tell him. So I did. And, again, I think it's probably just more my perception because I had so much embarrassment and shame about like telling him like, hey, I'm having thoughts about shooting people. Like, oh my God, please lock me up. And he was kind of like, okay, well, everybody has weird thoughts. I'm like, but no, like it's constant. Like, I think, oh, this is the other thing that, again, I still harbor a lot of shame. It almost felt like urges at times, and again, an OCD person would understand that. I'm like, no, it kind of feels like I want to, like, and he's like, Rachel, like, I know who you are. You would never, like, that's not you. He even came to therapy sessions with me, to try to learn how to help me, which was, gosh, I am indebted to him. I could never repay him for that. That just like, it really meant a lot to me. So he was very supportive. After the birth of my daughter, when it got really bad, I could tell he was scared. Like it was, it was so bad. And but again, he came to therapy sessions with me. He worked hard not to reassure me, when I would ask, like, do you think, like, do you ever have this thought? Or like, do you ever, because I needed it to be specifically exactly the way I perceived it in OCD, in my OCD brain. I needed somebody outside to validate that they had that exact thought and that exact feeling, and it was exactly the same. But he never would. And, of course that's frustrating, but it's what I needed and it's what he was supposed to do. But even still now with my health, anxieties, when my health OCD gets bad, he'll tell me, he's like, Rachel, like, this is your OCD. So yeah, he was very supportive. He wanted to learn about it. He came to therapy sessions. And like I said, like, he's just, like a rock, because I could imagine, having somebody you love, seeing them, they're complete. I mean, I was a completely different person because I'm normally outgoing and bubbly and I love life and I'm happy. I was so depressed, so sad. There were days, this is embarrassing to say, where I was praying to die because I was so in this horrible space in my mind. Like, I just couldn't even imagine an escape from it. I never thought I was going to get better. And to me, like, silence of the brain is all I wanted. I just would beg for peace. And to me, in my mind, the only way to get that would have been to die, which now looking back is so sad to know that I was suffering that much. So I think it was hard for him, but yeah, he was amazing. And again, probably only, I didn't tell many people because I had so much shame about it. And it was hard for me to tell him the thoughts I was having because it was so, they're weird and wild, and it's embarrassing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. And where are you at now with shame? Like, now that you're doing a bit better?
I still struggle with it. Like, I still, even thinking about like coming on this podcast, like I wanted to do it because I remember, like, I'm thinking about the new mom who's going through OCD now. And I hope they're going to listen to this and be like, oh, I know what you're explaining. Like, yeah, I want them to know that it can get so much better and life can go back to the way it was, and OCD doesn't define you. And in some ways it has become, I can utilize it to my advantage. I think shame, though, is still probably the one thing that I still hold on to. I'm working to let it go. Coming onto this podcast was part of that, where like, I don't want to feel shame about just being a human being and having intrusive thoughts like everybody, but I still do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a part of OCD recovery. Dealing with the shame. And do you do anything with self-compassion or try and practice that at all around shame?
I struggle there, if I'm being honest. Yes, I guess I do. I can't think of any like particular example to give you, but I do sometimes remind myself, for example, I guess I can give you examples. I think about where I was, right after the birth of my daughter to where I am now, like, and I think about like, gosh, like, think about what you did and the strength you had to get through that. Like, you should be so proud. And I always, I always said to Dr. Schultz, who was the one who really helped save me and pull me from the trenches of OCD, like, I hope my kids never have OCD. Like, I don't want anyone to ever go through this. This is absolute torture of my own, like, it's my own brain absolutely just torturing me. I feel imprisoned. And he was like, yeah, but if your kids have OCD, you're going to know exactly what to do to help them. So I think about that sometimes. I see some things in my daughter that she'll say, oh, I was thinking about this and I can't stop thinking about it. So, and that's okay. Cause I'm like, yeah, that's okay. And I know what to do. And he's right. Like, yeah, if she does, he would say, who better than to be her mom than you?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think it's important to remember, like, you didn't choose to have OCD. You didn't make a mistake that gave you OCD. This isn't, your choice.
Yeah.
And I think that's for me, a key part of the healing is just knowing that and understanding that.
Yeah.
It's not a character flaw. It's not a weakness.
Yeah. It feels like that when you're in the trenches of it. It feels 100%. Like a huge character flaw. And for somebody, again, typically people with OCD have like this strong moral compass. So for me, that's really hard to swallow, but you're right. Like, I always said, I have a very, very good friend who struggles with OCD too. And she was like a crutch through it, through the trenches of it. I always said to her, like, when I die and I go on to wherever we go, whoever made me, I'm going to ask them a lot of questions about why I had to have OCD. Like, why? This is awful. So, it's just, it's brutal. It's a tough thing to deal with, but thankfully, if you get the right help, it's manageable.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Good point. Were there any big roadblocks in your recovery? And if so, how did you overcome them?
Yeah, I think the biggest roadblock for me is not recognizing when I was ruminating and doing compulsions, because I didn't really recognize. To me, in my mind, I was doing exposures and this is how I'm going to get better. But really what I was doing was ruminating and checking. So what I would do is I would write these scripts of these delusion, as part of the therapy, write these delusional scripts of all these delusional thoughts and but then what I was realizing when I was doing is I was really just checking. So I would read them and I would read them out loud and I would do it religiously because I wanted so desperately to get better. But really what I was doing was just feeding the monster of OCD because I was just checking. And I don't think until it was pointed out to me that that's what I was doing, that was like the biggest roadblock for me to get over. Well, then how do I just stop? And it's so interesting to me that the cure to OCD is so simple because it's so convoluted in an OCD person's mind. But really the answer is, well, just stop. But okay, but I can't. But that's really the answer. Like when I would start to be like, do you believe it? Do you believe it? I had to get to the point where I'm like, I don't care. I don't care if I believe it. It doesn't matter if I believe it. It doesn't matter. So that I think not recognizing the compulsions I was doing, thinking they were really exposures. I think I now know that really I was just using the exposures as a chance to check. And it wasn't until that was pointed out to me that, I started to get better. I think the second thing is the shame and the guilt. I struggled to, tell all the thoughts I was having. I guess the thoughts don't really matter, but I struggled to be 100% honest because I had so much shame and so much guilt. So it was very hard to act, as if life was fine when I was really living in this prison in my mind constantly. So I had to kind of get over that and just accept you have something going on that you need to deal with and face. That was another one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you highlighted that. Like when you were doing the scripting of you were doing the exposure, but then you weren't doing the response prevention. You were doing the compulsion.
Yeah.
And that's obviously a common mistake in ERP. People think, why isn't it working?
Yeah.
You're doing the exposure. It's like, yes, but if you're still doing compulsions,
Yes.
it's not going to help as much.
Yeah. And it's hard obviously we know it's hard not to do the compulsion, but to read it and then not just in an OCD mind, I'm just constantly reeling okay, well, do you believe it? If you don't, and it had to feel just right. And there were moments where and again, just the compulsion, there were moments where I'd be okay, yeah, I really feel I don't believe it. And then I would get such this full body relief, but then that's temporary. And then finally, when I recognized that that's what I was doing, Dr. Schultz would often tell me, Rachel, picture OCD as a beast. He's like, you kick it, you keep it awake. Don't, people think you want to tiptoe around it. He's like, don't be afraid of it. You kick it, you wake it up, you stare at it in the face and you just ignore it. Then you just don't even deal with it. You don't try to answer it. You don't try to see if you feel certain. And that just really, I can't tell you. I would say in a matter of a couple weeks, I really noticed a decrease in my symptoms when I recognized that I was doing the exposure, but really just doing the exposure. And then I guess, just not really doing the response prevention.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Good point. It's hard to just leave it alone, right? And that's where the therapy comes in, as you found out. And eventually you get to the point where you're like, I'm not doing it. I'm not thinking about this brain. Shut up.
Yeah.
And it's obviously we're on audio, but behind me, you can see Alan Watts, the philosopher. And he said, the mind is like a muddy puddle. It's best cleared by leaving it alone.
Yes.
And I really like that.
Yeah, I feel like I've heard you say that before on the podcast. When I was in the throes of it, every Sunday, I would just wait to listen to the podcast because it's validating to hear other people who are going through the same thing and to know people got better. So I would take a walk every Sunday morning when I was in the throes of it and listen to this podcast. And I feel like I remember you saying that muddy water is clearer when just left alone. And it's such a simple concept, but it's so hard for an OCD mind to do.
Yeah. Oh, 100%, 100%. Yeah, I am. I'm glad you listened to the story episodes and really enjoyed them. I'm going to do more story episodes hopefully in 2025 than I did in 2024 to get back to that a bit more.
Yeah.
Cool. And I guess words of hope for anyone listening. What would you tell them?
So I think my biggest thing is that it gets so much better. If you can find a therapist who really knows what OCD is and can really see you for who you are, I think I don't know if this is just a bias, but I really do think people with OCD are some of the ones that I've met are like the kindest, strongest, most loving people I've ever met in my life. And I don't know if there's some connection between that or if that's just something, I don't know. But I would say that you can get better and you will get better. You just have to put in the work. And then in time, you're going to look back and you're going to say like, wow, like I got stronger because of that. And I think there's like, beauty with realizing how simple it is to just let things go and to not have to have the certainty, because there's really no certainty in life at all. So just the ability to kind of let that go is it's life changing. So then my words of hope would be that it gets so much better.
Yeah, 100%. Nice. Go for it.
Yeah, I never would have believed that, no. And when I was in the throes of it and really struggling, you would have told me that and I would have, undoubtedly said with certainty, I'm never going to get better. But I was really, really wrong about that.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. And then, you got a billboard. You can pick up the phone and call let's do 20-year-old self. What would you tell her?
I would tell her not to believe everything you think, especially about yourself. I would tell her that you are capable, that you, that you are going to do so much good in the world and bring good into the world. I would tell her that you're stronger than you think, and that things are going to get really hard, but they're going to get so much better, and life is going to get more beautiful for going through the things that you went through.
Yeah, nice. I like that. And you got a billboard where you live? What do you want written on that billboard?
I think my favorite quote, I knew, obviously listening to the podcast, I knew you were going to ask that, so I was thinking about it. And I think it would just be, this too shall pass. And I think I like that saying, because I think it goes for like when times are good in your life and when times are bad, because that's just like the ups and downs of life. When things are good, they might get bad again, but when they get bad, they're probably going to get good again. So I think just being able to be flexible and know that this is just seasons of life. But in your tool belt, that you're capable of dealing with whatever happens when it happens. So I think that would be my billboard. This too shall pass, not just for the bad times, but for the good times too, because I think it makes the good times more beautiful, knowing that, hold on to these moments, because that's just life. That's the ride of life.
Yeah, absolutely. Ebb and flow.
Yeah.
Okay. And is there anything else you wish you could have said or shared today?
No, I don't think so. I really appreciate you having me on. And I just want to thank you for the podcast. It really was some of the experts that you have on were so helpful. And it was just so insightful to be able to listen to the podcast. And it really helped me in my healing journey.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. It means a lot. And thank you for your story today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. And thank you to our Patreons who helped make this episode possible. And if you would like to find out more about Patreon and the rewards and benefits, then there will be a link in the episode description. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast. And thank you to NoCD for supporting our work. And if you want to find out more about NoCD, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories or click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, take care.